Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Josh, and I took over the narration from Philip. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's video, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. The night shift nurse at Otsuki Hospital felt the cold before she saw anything. A sudden drop in temperature that made her breath visible in the fluorescent lit hallway. And when she turned toward the geriatric ward at 2:17 in the morning, she noticed that the door to room 34 was standing open even though she had locked it herself less than an hour before. She walked slowly toward it, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor, and as she got closer she could hear something that made her stomach tighten, a wet dragging sound like fabric being pulled across tile, rhythmic and deliberate. She stopped 3 feet from the doorway and called out to ask if anyone needed assistance. But the sound continued without pause, and when she finally forced herself to look inside, she saw an elderly patient named Takahashi lying perfectly still in his bed, his eyes open and staring at the ceiling, while at the foot of his mattress stood a woman in a yukata so soaked with blood that it clung to her skeletal frame, her face pale as paper, her black hair hanging in wet strands that dripped dark spots onto the floor. Otsuki Hospital had been built in 1962 on the outskirts of a small town in Yamanashi Prefecture, a modest facility with 40 beds that served the aging population of the surrounding rural communities. The building sat at the edge of a bamboo forest, isolated enough that ambulances had to travel 20 minutes from the nearest highway. And during the day it seemed ordinary, even cheerful, with its cream-colored walls and potted plants in the waiting area. But the staff who worked the night shifts knew something had changed in the spring of 1998, a shift in the atmosphere that was hard to describe but impossible to ignore. Nurse Imiko Tanaka had been working at Otsuki for 6 years when the incidents began, and she was the first to report seeing the woman in the blood-stained yukata, though at the time she had convinced herself it was exhaustion or a trick of the dim lighting in the hallways. The hospital had been understaffed for months, forcing the night crew to cover more patients than was safe, and Emiko often found herself making rounds alone between midnight and 6 in the morning, checking vitals and administering medication to patients who were too old or too sick to do much besides sleep. She had always found the night shifts peaceful in their own way, a quiet routine that allowed her to think. But in late April of that year, the peace was shattered by something she could not explain. It started with small things, doors that would not stay closed, call buttons that rang from empty rooms, the faint smell of something rotting that appeared and disappeared without reason. Other nurses began to mention similar experiences, whispering to each other during shift changes about the feeling of being watched, about shadows that moved in peripheral vision, about the sound of footsteps echoing through empty corridors. The hospital administrator, a practical man named Yamada, who had run the facility for over a decade, dismissed these reports as stress and overwork, but Emiko noticed that he never stayed past sunset anymore, always leaving before the evening shift began. The patients seemed to sense it too, many of them becoming restless after dark, calling out for nurses more frequently, complaining of bad dreams and cold drafts that came from nowhere. On the night of May 7th, Emiko was assigned to the geriatric ward on the second floor, a long hallway with 12 rooms that housed the hospital's oldest and most fragile patients. She had just finished checking on a woman with pneumonia when she heard the sound of a door opening behind her, a slow creak that made her turn around. Room 34 was open again, and she was certain she had closed it only minutes before. She walked back and pushed the door shut, testing the latch to make sure it caught, and then she continued down the hall to the next room. But when she glanced back over her shoulder, she saw that the door to 34 was open once more, standing wide as if inviting her inside. She felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm, walking back a second time and closing the door more firmly, even going so far as to wedge a rubber stopper beneath it to keep it in place. She stood there for a moment, watching to see if it would open again, and when it stayed shut, she exhaled slowly and told herself she was being ridiculous. She turned to leave and had taken only 3 steps when she heard the wet dragging sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from inside the room. She froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the small flashlight clipped to her belt, and she listened as the sound continued, a rhythmic scrape that seemed to be moving closer to the door. She wanted to walk away, to pretend she had not heard anything, but she knew she could not leave a patient unattended, so she turned back and slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark except for the green glow of a heart monitor, and in that dim light she saw Takahashi lying in his bed, his frail body motionless, his eyes wide and glassy. At the foot of the bed stood a figure, a woman with long black hair and skin so pale it seemed to glow, wearing a yukata that was drenched in blood, the fabric clinging to her thin frame like a second skin. The woman did not move, did not look at Emiko, her gaze fixed on Takahashi as if she were waiting for something. Emiko tried to speak, tried to ask who the woman was and how she had gotten into the room, but her voice caught in her throat, and before she could force the words out, the figure turned her head slowly toward the doorway, her eyes black and empty, and Emiko felt a cold terror flood through her body that made her stumble backward into the hall. She ran to the nurse's station and grabbed the phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial the extension for security, and when the guard on duty answered, she tried to explain what she had seen, but the words came out in a jumbled rush that made little sense even to her own ears. The guard, a young man named Sato who had been hired only a month before, told her to stay where she was and that he would check the room himself. Emiko waited, her heart pounding, watching the hallway for any sign of movement, and after what felt like an eternity, Sato appeared at the end of the corridor, walking slowly toward her with a confused expression on his face. He told her that room 34 was empty except for Takahashi, who was asleep, and that there was no one else inside, no sign of anyone having been there at all. Emiko insisted that she had seen a woman, that the woman had been standing right there at the foot of the bed, but Sato only shook his head and suggested that she take a break, that maybe the long shift was getting to her. She wanted to argue, to make him believe her, but she could see in his eyes that he thought she was either lying or losing her mind, so she nodded and said nothing more. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Emiko could not shake the image of the pale face, those empty eyes, the blood-soaked yukata that dripped onto the floor. When her shift ended at 6 in the morning, she went straight to Administrator Yamada's office and told him everything, expecting him to dismiss her concerns the way he had dismissed the others. But instead he went very still, his face draining of color, and he asked her to describe the woman in detail. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, and then he told her something that made her blood run cold. 15 years earlier, a patient had died in room 34, a young woman who had been admitted after a car accident, and in the days before her death, she had become violent, attacking nurses and screaming about seeing things that were not there. The official report listed the cause of death as internal bleeding, but the nurses who had been on duty that night whispered about something else, about the way the woman's body had been found in a position that suggested she had been trying to escape, about the bruises on her wrists that looked like fingerprints, about the blood that had soaked through her hospital gown for no apparent reason. Over the following weeks, more nurses reported seeing the woman in the blood-stained yukata, always on the second floor, always near the geriatric ward, always standing beside a patient who would be dead or missing within 24 hours. The sightings followed a pattern that was impossible to ignore, appearing between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, lingering for only a few seconds before vanishing as if she had never been there at all. Emiko saw her twice more, once in the hallway outside room 29 and once reflected in the window of the nurse's station, her pale face staring back with an expression of profound sadness. Each time, Emiko felt the same bone-deep cold, the same paralyzing fear that made it hard to breathe, and each time the patient she had been standing near was gone by morning. The hospital tried to keep the disappearances quiet, But word spread quickly through the small town, and families began demanding that their loved ones be transferred to other facilities. Administrator Yamada hired a night security team to patrol the second floor, installing cameras in the hallways and patient rooms, hoping that the increased presence would either deter the apparition or provide some rational explanation for what was happening. The cameras recorded hours of footage, grainy black and white images of empty corridors and sleeping patients, but on 3 separate occasions they captured something that defied explanation. In each recording, the figure of a woman appeared in a locked room, standing motionless at the foot of a patient's bed, her outline blurred and indistinct, visible for only a few frames before the image distorted and the feed cut to static. The timestamp on the recordings always showed the same narrow window, between 2:15 and 2:45 in the morning, and each time the patient in the room was found unresponsive the following day, their bodies cold and stiff despite having shown no signs of distress during earlier checks. The staff began to refuse night shifts, several nurses quitting outright, and those who remained worked in pairs, refusing to enter the second floor alone. Emiko herself requested a transfer to the day shift, unable to face another night in the presence of whatever haunted those hallways. But even during the daylight hours, she could feel it watching, a malevolent presence that seemed to seep through the walls and cling to the air like smoke. The peak of the terror came on a sweltering night in late July, when the hospital experienced a power outage that plunged the entire building into darkness. The backup generators kicked in after a few seconds, but the lights on the second floor refused to turn on, leaving the geriatric ward bathed in shadow. Emiko was one of 3 nurses on duty that night, and she was in the medication room when the lights went out, fumbling in the darkness for her flashlight. She heard shouting from down the hall, panicked voices calling for help, and she ran toward the sound, her flashlight beam cutting through the blackness. What she found made her stop dead in her tracks. Every door on the second floor was standing open, the rooms beyond them dark and silent, and in the center of the hallway stood the woman in the blood-stained yukata, more solid and visible than she had ever been before. Her hair hung in long, wet strands that reached the floor, her skin so pale it seemed translucent, and her eyes were no longer empty, but filled with a terrible awareness, a hunger that made Emiko's legs go weak. The woman did not move, did not speak, but Emiko could feel her gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to draw breath. Behind the apparition, Emiko could see the other nurses frozen in place, their faces pale with terror, and she realized that they were all trapped, unable to move forward or retreat. The woman began to walk, her bare feet making no sound on the floor, moving slowly from room to room, pausing beside each bed as if inspecting the patients, and wherever she passed, the temperature dropped so sharply that frost formed on the windows and the breath of the living became visible in the air. Emiko wanted to run, wanted to scream, but she could only stand there and watch as the figure moved closer, her blood-stained yukata leaving a wet trail on the linoleum, and when the woman finally reached her, standing so close that Emiko could smell the coppery scent of old blood, she leaned in and whispered something in a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. The words were incomprehensible, a language Emiko did not recognize, but the meaning was clear enough. A warning or a curse that sent ice through her veins. Then the lights flickered back on, the sudden brightness blinding after so long in darkness, and when Emiko's eyes adjusted, the woman was gone, leaving nothing behind but the wet footprints that led to room 34 and then simply stopped, as if she had walked through the wall. The following morning, Administrator Yamada called an emergency meeting with the remaining staff and announced that the hospital would be closing temporarily for renovations, a decision that everyone understood was permanent, even if he would not say so outright. The official explanation cited structural issues and budgetary concerns, but the truth was that no one would work there anymore, and the few patients who remained were transferred to facilities in neighboring towns. Emiko helped with the transition, spending her final days at Otsuki packing medical records and clearing out supply rooms. And on her last afternoon, she found herself standing in the doorway of room 34, staring at the empty bed where Takahashi had died. The room felt different now, colder somehow, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened there. She thought about the woman in the yukata, about the patients who had disappeared, about the wet footprints that had led nowhere, and she wondered if closing the hospital would be enough to stop whatever presence lingered in these halls. Before she left, she walked down to the basement records room and searched through old files until she found the report from 15 years earlier, the one about the young woman who had died in room 34. The details were sparse, just a name, Ayako Mori, and a date of death. But clipped to the back of the file was a photograph, a grainy black and white image of a woman in her early 20s with long dark hair and delicate features. Emiko stared at the photo for a long time, and then she put it back in the file and walked out of the hospital for the last time, knowing that some questions were better left unanswered. Otsuki Hospital remained closed for the rest of that year, the building slowly falling into disrepair, windows broken by vandals, walls covered in graffiti. The locals avoided the area after sunset, telling stories about strange lights in the windows and the sound of footsteps echoing through empty rooms. And to this day, no one has attempted to reopen the facility or tear it down, as if everyone understands that some places are meant to be left alone. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as disturbing as that story was, it is far from the only case of a hospital becoming the site of unexplained terror. Across the waters in Bangladesh, another medical facility would experience its own haunting, this time centered around the most vulnerable patients of all, the children. What began as strange sounds in the night would escalate into encounters that left staff questioning everything they thought they understood about the boundary between life and death. And like the nurses at Otsuki, they would learn that some presences refuse to leave, no matter how many years have passed. The pediatric ward at Chittagong Medical Center occupied the entire third floor of the hospital's east wing, a sprawling space with 40 beds arranged in rows, separated by thin curtains that offered little privacy, but allowed nurses to monitor multiple patients at once. The ward served children from across the region, treating everything from routine infections to serious injuries, and during the day it was filled with the sounds of crying babies and worried parents speaking in hushed voices. But at night, after visiting hours ended and the overhead lights were dimmed, the ward took on a different character, becoming a place of shadows and whispered conversations between the nurses who worked the graveyard shift. Dr. Rashid Khan had been the head pediatrician at Chittagong Medical for 8 years when the incidents began in the autumn of 2004, and he prided himself on running a department that was both efficient and compassionate, where children received the best possible care despite the hospital's limited resources. He was a practical man, trained in London and accustomed to dealing with difficult cases, and he had little patience for superstition or folklore, dismissing such things as the products of uneducated minds. So when one of his nurses, a young woman named Nasrin, came to him with a story about hearing children crying in the ward when all the patients were asleep, he assumed she was either mistaken or overly tired. He told her to double-check her rounds and make sure she was not missing anyone, and he thought nothing more of it until 2 other nurses reported the same phenomenon a week later. The crying started around midnight, a soft whimpering sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, drifting through the ward like smoke. The nurses would check each bed, counting the children to make sure none had woken, but every time they found all the patients sound asleep, their breathing slow and steady, their faces peaceful in the dim glow of the night lights. The crying would continue for 10 or 15 minutes and then stop abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than it should, as if something were holding its breath and waiting. Nasreen began keeping a log of the occurrences, noting the time and duration of each episode, and she noticed a pattern. The crying always happened between midnight and 3 in the morning, always on nights when the ward was at less than half capacity, and it was always accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature that made the windows fog over despite the humid climate outside. She showed her notes to Dr. Khan, hoping he would take her concerns seriously, but he only glanced at the pages and suggested that the sounds were likely coming from the maternity ward, 1 floor below, carried up through the ventilation system. Nasreen wanted to argue, to tell him that the crying sounded nothing like newborns, but more like older children, their voices thin and desperate, but she could see that he had already made up his mind, so she nodded and said nothing more. The other nurses were not as willing to let it go, several of them requesting transfers or calling in sick, and within a month, the night shift was chronically understaffed, forcing Dr. Khan to spend more time on the ward himself to cover the gaps. It was during one of these night shifts, in late October, that Dr. Khan finally experienced something he could not explain away with logic or science. He was in the medication room preparing injections for the morning rounds when he heard a sound that made him pause, a child's voice calling out softly from somewhere in the ward. He set down the syringe and walked out into the main room, his eyes scanning the rows of beds. But all the children appeared to be asleep. He was about to return to his work when he saw it, a small handprint appearing on the inside of a fogged window at the far end of the ward, tiny fingers pressed against the glass as if someone were trying to get his attention. The print was too high for any of the patients to reach, at least 3 feet above the nearest bed, and as he watched, it slowly faded, leaving behind only the condensation on the window. He stood there for a long moment, his rational mind searching for an explanation, a draft perhaps, or moisture from the ventilation system. But he could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He walked over to the window and placed his own hand against the glass, comparing the size, and he realized that the print had been made by a child no older than 4 or 5 years old. He turned to look at the nearest bed and saw that it was empty, the sheets pulled back as if someone had just gotten up, and beneath the mattress he could see the faint outline of something small and round. He knelt down and reached under the bed, his fingers closing around a wooden toy, a small carved elephant that was smooth with age. He had never seen it before, and none of the current patients had brought such a toy with them, so he slipped it into his pocket and made a mental note to ask the day shift nurses if they knew where it had come from. The following week, the incidents escalated. Nurses began reporting sightings of a child wandering the ward after midnight, a small figure in a faded hospital gown who walked barefoot between the beds, pausing to look down at the sleeping patients before moving on. The child never responded when called, never turned to face the person who saw them, and if anyone tried to approach, the figure would vanish, simply blinking out of existence as if they had never been there at all. Nasreen saw the child 3 times, always at a distance, always in the same worn gown that hung loosely on their thin frame, and each time she felt a profound sadness wash over her, a grief so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She tried to follow the figure once, walking quickly down the center aisle of the ward, but the child turned a corner into the supply closet, and when Nasrin opened the door seconds later, the small room was empty, nothing inside but shelves of linens and medical equipment. She told Dr. Khan about the encounter, describing the child in detail, the bare feet, the way their dark hair fell across their face, the sense of overwhelming sorrow that seemed to radiate from their small form, and this time he did not dismiss her. Instead, he asked her to show him exactly where she had seen the figure, and together they walked the length of the ward, Nasreen pointing out the spots where the child had appeared. Dr. Khan listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful, and when she finished, he told her something that made her stomach drop. The hospital had been built in stages, the original structure dating back to the 1940s, and during renovations in the early 90s, workers had discovered a collapsed section of the old building, a forgotten wing that had been sealed off decades earlier. Inside, They had found the remains of several rooms that had once served as a children's ward, and in one of those rooms, buried beneath rubble and debris, they had found the skeleton of a small child, no more than 5 years old, still wearing the remnants of a hospital gown. The discovery had been kept quiet, the remains given a proper burial, and the incident recorded only in the hospital's private archives, and over time, it had been largely forgotten. But Dr. Khan remembered reading about it when he first started working at Chittagong Medical, and he had always wondered about the child, who they had been, and how they had ended up trapped in that abandoned wing. Now, standing in the pediatric ward with Nasreen, he felt a creeping certainty that the child had never truly left, that some part of them remained tethered to this place, wandering the halls in search of something they could not name. He did not share these thoughts with Nasreen, not wanting to frighten her further, but that night he stayed in the ward long after his shift ended, sitting in the nurse's station with the lights turned low, waiting to see if the child would appear. Hours passed in silence, the only sounds the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional rustle of a patient shifting in their sleep, and he was beginning to think that nothing would happen when he felt the temperature drop, a sudden chill that made his breath visible in the air. He looked up and saw the child standing at the end of the ward, backlit by the glow of the emergency exit sign, their small form barely more than a shadow. They did not move, did not make a sound, but Dr. Khan could feel their gaze on him, could sense the weight of their presence filling the room. He stood slowly, not wanting to startle them, and took a step forward, intending to speak, to ask what they needed. But before he could say a word, the child turned and walked through the wall, disappearing into solid concrete as if it were nothing more than mist. The haunting reached its peak on a night in early December when the ward was nearly empty. Only 7 children admitted, all of them recovering from minor illnesses or injuries. Nasreen was working with another nurse, a woman named Fatima, who had been at the hospital for over 20 years, and together they were making their final rounds before settling in for the long hours until dawn. They had just checked on the last patient when they heard it, the sound of running footsteps echoing through the ward, small feet slapping against the tile floor with desperate urgency. They turned toward the sound and saw the child, clearer and more solid than ever before, running down the center aisle with their arms outstretched, their mouth open as if crying out, though no sound emerged. The figure ran straight toward them, and both nurses froze, unable to move or speak. And as the child drew closer, they could see details that made their blood run cold. The child's hospital gown was torn and stained with something dark. Their bare feet left wet prints on the floor, and their eyes were wide with terror. Pupils dilated so much that the irises were barely visible. The child reached them and passed right through, a sensation like ice water flooding through their bodies. And then, they were standing in the empty ward, alone. The only evidence of what they had witnessed, the wet footprints that led from one end of the room to the other, and then simply stopped. Nasreen and Fatima stood there in stunned silence, their hearts pounding, and then they heard it, the soft sound of crying coming from the direction where the footprints ended. They walked over slowly, hand in hand, and found themselves standing in front of an empty crib that had been pushed against the wall, unused for months. Inside the crib, nestled in the corner, was a small wooden toy, a carved elephant identical to the one Dr. Khan had found weeks earlier, and as they stared at it, the crying grew louder, filling the ward with a sound so heartbreaking that both women began to weep, unable to stop the tears that streamed down their faces. Dr. Khan was called in immediately, and when he arrived, he found the 2 nurses sitting in the break room, still shaken, still crying, and he knew without asking that they had seen the child. He went to the ward alone and stood before the empty crib, looking down at the wooden elephant, and for the first time in his life, he felt the presence of something beyond his understanding, something that science could not measure or explain. He picked up the toy and held it in his hands, feeling the smooth wood worn by countless small fingers, and he made a decision. The next day, he went to the hospital archives and requested all records related to the collapsed wing and the child who had been found there. The files were incomplete, much of the information lost to time or deliberately omitted, but he pieced together what he could. The child had been a patient in the old ward in the 1960s, admitted for treatment of tuberculosis, and according to the few existing records, they had died during a fire that had broken out in the middle of the night, a fire that had spread quickly through the old wooden structure and claimed several lives before it could be contained. The child's name had been lost. No family members ever came forward to claim the remains, and they had been buried in an unmarked grave in the hospital cemetery. Dr. Khan took the wooden elephant and visited the cemetery, searching for hours until he found the small plot where the child lay. And he knelt down and placed the toy on the bare earth, whispering a prayer for the soul of the nameless child who had wandered the halls for so many years. Whether it was the prayer or the gesture or simply coincidence, the sighting stopped after that night, the crying ceased, and the pediatric ward returned to normal, or as normal as any place can be that holds such memories within its walls. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the line between the living and the dead becomes so thin that those caught in between can barely tell the difference. The stories we have shared so far are only the beginning, and as we continue deeper into the shadows of Asia's most haunted places, you will encounter events that challenge everything you thought you knew about reality itself. If you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description. Only if you want to, of course. I already appreciate you listening to my videos. Now let us continue with what happens when ordinary people find themselves facing the extraordinary. The guard tower at Pudu Prison stood 20 feet above the main courtyard, offering a view of the entire complex, including the hospital wing that sat in the northeastern corner, separated from the general population by 2 chain-link fences and a gate that was kept locked at all times. On the night of August 14th, 1981, Officer Ahmad Razak was assigned to the tower from midnight to 8 in the morning, and at approximately 3:30, he heard screaming coming from the hospital building, not the usual sounds of pain or distress that sometimes echoed through the prison, but something different, a chorus of voices all crying out at once in what sounded like pure terror. He grabbed his radio and tried to contact the hospital guards, but the line was dead, nothing but static, and when he looked down at the building, he saw that the lights in several windows were flickering on and off in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. He climbed down from the tower and ran across the yard, his boots pounding on the concrete, and when he reached the hospital gate, he found it standing open, the lock broken, hanging by a single hinge. The screaming had stopped by then, replaced by an unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, and as he stepped through the gate, he felt the temperature drop so suddenly that his breath became visible in the humid night air. Pudu Prison had been built by the British colonial administration in 1891, a sprawling complex designed to hold the worst criminals in what was then Malaya, and over the decades it had earned a reputation for brutality and violence that lingered long after independence. The prison hospital was added in 1948 to treat inmates who were too sick or injured to be sent to civilian facilities, a squat 2-story building with barred windows and reinforced doors that gave it the appearance of a fortress rather than a place of healing. The conditions inside were notoriously poor, understaffed, and underfunded, with medical supplies that were often outdated or in short supply, and the mortality rate was high enough that the hospital had its own morgue in the basement, a concrete room with metal tables where bodies were kept until they could be transported to the city cemetery. The staff who worked there were a mix of civilian nurses and doctors hired by the prison administration, most of them recent graduates who took the job because they needed the money and could not find work elsewhere, and the turnover was constant, with new faces appearing every few months to replace those who quit or transferred out. Among the long-term staff, there were whispers about the hospital being cursed, stories passed down from one generation of workers to the next about strange occurrences that happened when the sun went down, doors that opened and closed on their own, the sound of footsteps in empty hallways, shadows that moved independently of any light source. Most dismissed these stories as superstition, the product of overactive imaginations working in a high-stress environment. But there were a few who claimed to have seen things that could not be explained, encounters that left them shaken and unwilling to work the night shift ever again. One of these was nurse Fatima Binti Hassan, who had been employed at the hospital since 1976 and who had witnessed more than her share of death and suffering during her 5 years there. She was a devout woman, deeply religious, and she had always believed that the souls of the dead moved on to their final judgment. But after what she experienced in the summer of '81, she began to wonder if some spirits were too angry or too confused to leave, trapped in the places where they had died, unable to find peace. The incident began on a Thursday night in early August when Fatima was working the overnight shift in the main ward, a long room with 30 beds arranged in 2 rows facing each other. The ward housed inmates with chronic illnesses or recovering from surgery, men who were too weak to pose a threat and who spent most of their time sleeping or staring at the ceiling. Fatima had just finished administering medications and was sitting at the nurse's station completing her paperwork when she heard a sound that made her look up. A soft swishing noise like fabric being dragged across the floor. She scanned the ward but saw nothing unusual. All the patients appeared to be asleep, and she was about to return to her work when the sound came again, closer this time, moving slowly down the center aisle between the beds. She stood and walked toward it, her flashlight in hand, and as she moved deeper into the ward, she felt the temperature drop, not gradually but all at once, as if she had stepped into a walk-in freezer. Her breath misted in the air, and she could see frost forming on the metal bed frames, tiny crystals of ice that glittered in the beam of her flashlight. She stopped in the middle of the aisle and turned in a slow circle, trying to locate the source of the cold. And that was when she saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the ward near the window. A woman in a nurse's uniform that was outdated by at least 2 decades. The woman's back was to her, and Fatima could see that she was holding something in her hands, a clipboard or a chart, and she appeared to be writing notes, her movements methodical and precise. Fatima called out to ask who she was and what she was doing there at this hour, but the woman did not respond, did not even turn around, and as Fatima walked closer, she realized with a shock that made her stumble that the woman had no head. Her uniform collar ended in empty space, and yet she continued to move, continued to write, as if unaware of her condition. Fatima backed away slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and she turned and ran from the ward, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She burst into the staff room where 2 guards were playing cards and told them what she had seen, the words tumbling out on a rush that made little sense, and the guards exchanged glances that suggested they thought she was either joking or having some kind of breakdown. But when she insisted that they come with her, that they see for themselves, one of them agreed, a young man named Ismail, who had been working at the prison for less than a year. They walked back to the ward together, Fatima staying close behind him, and when they reached the spot where she had seen the figure, there was nothing there, just the empty aisle and the sleeping patients. Ismail told her that she must have been mistaken, that the stress of the job could play tricks on the mind, but Fatima shook her head and pointed to the window where the figure had been standing. The glass was covered in a thin layer of frost, and on the sill sat a clipboard with a chart clipped to it, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting on it dated 1953. Ismail picked up the clipboard and examined it, his expression confused. And then he looked at Fatima and told her that they should take it to the supervisor, that someone needed to explain how a chart from nearly 30 years ago had ended up in the ward. They walked to the supervisor's office together, but when they arrived, they found the door locked and the lights off. And rather than wait until morning, Ismail decided to lock the clipboard in his desk drawer and deal with it during the day shift. Fatima agreed, though she could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that the appearance of the headless nurse was not a random occurrence, but a warning of something worse to come. Over the next week, other staff members reported similar sightings, always on the night shift, always in different parts of the hospital. A doctor named Rajesh saw the figure in the surgical wing, standing over an empty operating table with her hands moving as if she were performing an incision on an invisible patient. A janitor named Lim claimed he saw her in the basement morgue, bending over one of the metal tables, her headless form silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lights. Each time she appeared, the temperature would drop and objects would begin to move on their own. Medicine trays sliding across counters, doors slamming shut with such force that the locks broke, windows rattling in their frames as if shaken by an unseen hand. The inmates in the ward began to complain of nightmares, all of them describing the same dream: a woman in a white uniform walking between their beds, checking their pulses with cold fingers, leaning down as if to whisper something even though she had no mouth to speak with. Several prisoners became so agitated that they had to be sedated, and 2 guards quit outright, refusing to work in the hospital wing, no matter how much they were offered. The prison administration tried to keep the incidents quiet, not wanting word to spread among the general population, but rumors traveled quickly through Pudu, and soon everyone knew that the hospital was haunted, that something malevolent was stalking the halls after dark. The warden, a pragmatic man named Abdullah, who had little patience for ghost stories, ordered an investigation into the disturbances, convinced that there was a rational explanation, perhaps a gas leak or faulty wiring that was causing hallucinations, or electrical interference. But the engineers who inspected the building found nothing wrong. All systems were functioning normally, and the strange occurrences continued unabated. The situation reached its peak on the night of August 14th, when the hospital experienced what could only be described as a mass haunting. Fatima was on duty again, working alongside 2 other nurses and the guard Ismail, and shortly after midnight, the lights in the main ward began to flicker, cycling on and off in rapid succession. The patients woke and started shouting, pointing at the far end of the room where the headless nurse had appeared. But this time she was not alone. Behind her stood a line of other figures, men and women in outdated medical uniforms, some of them missing limbs, others with visible wounds on their bodies, all of them moving in unison as they walked slowly down the aisle between the beds. The temperature plummeted, frost spreading across the floor and climbing the walls, and the patients began to scream, a sound so loud and sustained that it could be heard throughout the entire prison complex. Fatima tried to run, but found that her legs would not move, as if she were rooted to the spot, and she watched in frozen horror as the figures passed within inches of her, their presence radiating a cold so intense it burned her skin. Ismail grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung it at the nearest figure, but the metal passed right through the apparition as if it were made of smoke, and the force of his swing threw him off balance, sending him crashing to the floor. The procession continued, moving from bed to bed, each figure pausing to place a hand on the forehead of a patient, and wherever they touched, the inmate would go, rigid, their eyes rolling back in their heads, their mouths opening in silent screams. The entire event lasted less than 5 minutes, but to those who witnessed it, it felt like hours, an eternity of terror that left them shaking and unable to speak. When the figures finally faded, disappearing into the walls as if they had never been there, the ward was in chaos, patients sobbing and calling for help, medical equipment scattered across the floor, and a smell lingering in the air like burned metal and decay. The aftermath of that night was swift and decisive. The warden ordered the hospital wing closed immediately, all patients transferred to other facilities or back to their cells if they were well enough, and the building was sealed, the doors locked, and the windows boarded up. An official report was filed citing structural concerns and the need for extensive renovations, but everyone who had been present that night knew the truth, that the building was not safe, that something had taken hold of it and would not let go. Fatima resigned the following week, unable to return to a place that had shown her things she could never forget. And she was not the only one. Within a month, nearly half the hospital staff had left, replaced by new workers who were not told about the incidents and who would discover the truth for themselves soon enough. Officer Ahmad, who had been the first to respond that night, spent hours giving his account to investigators who clearly did not believe him, and when he insisted that he was telling the truth, he was quietly transferred to another facility with a notation in his file suggesting he needed psychiatric evaluation. The hospital remained closed for 3 years, and when it finally reopened in 1984, it was under new management with new staff who were instructed never to speak of what had happened in August of '81. But the stories persisted, passed down through generations of guards and medical workers, whispered accounts of the headless nurse and the procession of the dead, and to this day, those who worked at Pudu during that period refuse to discuss the details, their silence more eloquent than any words could be. The prison itself was eventually demolished in the late 90s, the land redeveloped into commercial property, but locals still avoid the area after dark, claiming that on certain nights you can still hear the screaming, still see shadows moving in the empty spaces where the hospital once stood, still feel the bone-deep cold that signals the presence of something that should not exist. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The haunting at Pudu prison was a collective nightmare, experienced by many and dismissed by those who were not there. But sometimes the most terrifying encounters are those witnessed by only 1 or 2 people, moments so private and so disturbing that they become impossible to share without sounding mad. In the mountains of western India, a small clinic would become the site of such an encounter, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew so thin that a nurse found herself watching something that defied all logic, something that left her questioning not just what she had seen, but the very nature of reality itself. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when the power went out at Shirgan Rural Health Clinic, plunging the small facility into darkness just after 9 in the evening. Nurse Meera Patil was alone in the building except for 2 elderly patients who were sleeping in the observation ward, both of them recovering from minor ailments and expected to be discharged in the morning. The clinic sat at the edge of a village in Maharashtra, a modest single-story structure with 4 rooms, a small pharmacy, and an operating theater that was rarely used except for emergency procedures. Meera had worked there for 6 years, ever since graduating from nursing school, and she knew every inch of the building, could navigate the hallways in complete darkness if needed. But that night, standing in the sudden blackness with only the sound of rain pounding on the metal roof, she felt a disquiet that she could not name, a sense that something was wrong even though nothing had happened yet. She found a flashlight in the nurse's station and checked on the patients to make sure they were comfortable, and then she walked to the generator room at the back of the building, intending to start the backup power. The generator was old and temperamental, requiring several tries before it would catch, and she was in the middle of her 3rd attempt when she heard a sound that made her freeze, the distinct clatter of metal instruments falling to the floor, coming from the direction of the operating theater. Shirgaon Rural Health Clinic had been established in the 1970s as part of a government initiative to bring basic medical care to remote villages, and for decades it had served the community well, treating everything from infections to injuries to complications during childbirth. The operating theater was small, barely large enough for 1 surgical table and the necessary equipment, and it was used sparingly, perhaps once or twice a month, for procedures that could not wait for transport to the district hospital. The room was kept locked when not in use, the instruments stored in glass-fronted cabinets, and only Dr. Sharma, the clinic's senior physician, and Meera had keys. Dr. Sharma had left hours ago, heading home before the worst of the storm hit, and Meera knew with absolute certainty that she had locked the theater after cleaning it that afternoon. She stood in the generator room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and debated whether to investigate the sound or ignore it, chalking it up to the storm rattling loose objects. But the noise came again, louder this time, a cascade of metal hitting tile, and she knew she could not leave it unchecked. She walked slowly down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty building, and when she reached the operating theater, she found the door standing open, the lock intact but disengaged, as if someone had turned it from the inside. She pushed the door wider and shone her flashlight into the room, the beam sweeping across the surgical table, the instrument trays, the cabinets along the far wall. Everything appeared to be in order, nothing out of place, but the floor near the table was scattered with surgical tools, scalpels and forceps and clamps arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, forming a circle around a wet spot on the tile. The spot was roughly the size of a person. The water pooled as if someone had lain there and then stood up, leaving only the outline behind. Mira stepped into the room, her heart beginning to race, and she crouched down to examine the tools, noting that they were clean and dry, no signs of rust or contamination. She could not understand how they had ended up on the floor. The cabinets were still locked, and the trays on the counter were undisturbed. She was about to gather them up when she heard breathing, a soft rasping sound that seemed to come from directly behind her. She spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping the room, but there was nothing there, just empty space and shadows. The breathing continued, steady and rhythmic, and she realized with a jolt of fear that it was coming from the area near the surgical table, from the air itself, as if something invisible were standing there, inhaling and exhaling with wet, labored breaths. Mira backed toward the door, her flashlight trained on the spot where the breathing seemed to originate, and as she moved, she saw the surgical drape on the table begin to shift, lifting slowly as if being pulled by unseen hands. The fabric rose and fell in a pattern that mimicked the rise and fall of a chest, and beneath it she could see indentations forming on the table, depressions that looked like shoulders and hips, the shape of a body that was not there. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her voice would not come. Her throat closed tight with terror, and all she could do was watch as the drape settled back down and the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound, a heavy, oppressive quiet that pressed against her ears, and in that silence she heard something else, the faint metallic scrape of instruments being moved, not on the floor but on the table itself, as if someone were selecting tools for a procedure. She forced herself to step closer, her hands shaking so badly that the flashlight beam wavered, and she saw that the scalpel and forceps that had been on the floor were now on the table, arranged neatly on a sterile cloth, positioned exactly as they would be for surgery. And above the table, barely visible in the dim light, she saw a shadow, a dark shape that was bent over the table, its arms moving in precise surgical motions, suturing and cutting and adjusting, working on a patient that did not exist. She stood frozen in the doorway, unable to look away, and she watched as the shadow continued its work, its movements becoming faster and more frantic, the instruments flashing in the beam of her flashlight as they moved through the air. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that her breath became visible, and the walls began to sweat with condensation, droplets running down the painted surface like tears. The shadow paused and turned toward her, and though it had no face, no features at all, she felt its gaze on her, felt the weight of its attention pressing down like a physical force. She stumbled backward into the hallway and slammed the door shut, her hands fumbling with the lock, and she stood there gasping for breath, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind the door she could hear movement, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the clink of metal on metal, and she realized that whatever was in that room was still working, still performing its invisible surgery on a patient that only it could see. She ran back to the generator room and tried again to start the backup power, her hands working frantically, and after what felt like an eternity, the engine caught and roared to life, the lights throughout the clinic flickering on. She walked slowly back to the operating theater, dreading what she might find, and when she opened the door, the room was exactly as it should be. The surgical drape folded neatly on the table, the instruments back in their cabinets, the floor dry and clean. The only evidence that anything had happened was the smell, a sharp antiseptic odor that filled the room, despite the fact that no cleaning solution had been used, and the wet outline on the table, a shape roughly the size of a human body soaked through the drape and pooling on the stainless steel surface. Mira reported the incident to Dr. Sharma the following morning, describing everything she had seen and heard, and she expected him to dismiss her concerns or suggest that she had been frightened by the storm and had imagined the whole thing. But instead he listened carefully, his expression grave, and when she finished, he told her something that made her blood run cold. 10 years earlier, before Mira had been hired, the clinic had experienced a tragedy during a routine surgery. A patient, a young woman who had been admitted for an emergency appendectomy, had died on the operating table due to complications that the staff had not anticipated. The surgeon, a visiting doctor from the district hospital, had tried everything to save her, working for over an hour to stop the internal bleeding. But in the end, there was nothing he could do. The woman's death had been ruled unavoidable, a tragic combination of circumstances that no one could have predicted, but the surgeon had never forgiven himself, and 6 months later he had committed suicide, unable to live with the guilt of losing a patient. Dr. Sharma had been present during the surgery, assisting, and he remembered the surgeon's desperation, the way he had continued to work, even after it was clear that the woman was gone, unable to accept that he had failed. The clinic had been closed for a week after the suicide, the operating theater scrubbed and sterilized, but some of the staff had reported strange occurrences afterward, tools that moved on their own, the smell of antiseptic appearing without cause, the sense of being watched while working alone. Most had attributed these experiences to grief and stress, but Dr. Sharma had always wondered if something had remained, some echo of that terrible night, trapped in the room where so much pain and guilt had been concentrated. Mira continued to work at the clinic, but she refused to enter the operating theater alone, and she noticed that other staff members seemed to share her reluctance, always finding excuses to avoid the room after dark. The incidents did not stop entirely, though they became less frequent, appearing only during storms or on nights when the power failed. Workers would report hearing the sound of surgery being performed, the beep of monitors that were not turned on, voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones as if discussing a patient's condition. Dr. Sharma eventually retired, and new staff rotated through the clinic, most of them unaware of the history, but those who worked the night shifts learned quickly that the operating theater was best avoided, that some rooms hold memories so strong they become indistinguishable from reality. Mira herself left after 2 more years, moving to a hospital in the city where the lights never went out and the past was not so close to the surface, but she never forgot what she had seen that night during the monsoon. The shadow bent over the table, performing surgery on a patient who had died a decade before, trying in vain to correct a mistake that could never be undone. The clinic still operates today, serving the village as it always has, but the operating theater is used only in the most dire emergencies, and even then, the staff work quickly, eager to finish and leave, as if they can sense the presence of something that refuses to rest, something that will continue its endless surgery until the end of time. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories are different. They are quieter but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends. Where the previous tales involved multiple witnesses and dramatic confrontations, what comes next are encounters that happened in near silence, witnessed by only 1 or 2 people who have carried the weight of these experiences alone, unable to share them without being dismissed as unreliable or mentally unstable. These are the stories that prove sometimes the most horrifying moments are not the ones filled with screaming and chaos, but the ones that unfold in whispers and shadows, leaving behind nothing but doubt and the terrible certainty that something impossible has occurred. In the final part, we move deeper into the heart of Asian horror, to places where the supernatural does not announce itself with violence, but seeps slowly into reality until those who witness it can no longer trust their own perceptions. The trauma ward at Yongdong Severance Hospital occupied the fourth floor of the main building, a utilitarian space with linoleum floors and walls painted an institutional beige that had faded to a sickly yellow under decades of fluorescent lighting. Room 407 sat at the end of the east corridor, separated from the other patient rooms by a supply closet and a set of double doors that led to the emergency stairwell. And in the autumn of 1993, it became the focus of an investigation that would leave several staff members questioning everything they thought they understood about the nature of consciousness and the persistence of trauma beyond death. The call button for room 407 began ringing at precisely 2:13 every morning in late September, the light above the door flashing in the darkened hallway, signaling that a patient needed assistance. But when nurses responded, they found the room empty, the bed stripped down to the bare mattress, the call button mechanism sitting on the side table untouched. The first few times it happened, the staff assumed it was a malfunction, some electrical short or crossed wire that was causing the system to activate on its own. But after a maintenance technician inspected the wiring and found nothing wrong, they began to wonder if something else was at work. Yongdong Severance Hospital had been founded in 1957 in the Gangwon province, serving a region that was still recovering from the devastation of the Korean War. And over the decades, it had grown from a small clinic into a major medical center with over 300 beds and a reputation for treating the most severe trauma cases in the eastern part of the country. The fourth floor trauma ward handled patients who had been in car accidents, industrial injuries, and violent incidents, people who required intensive monitoring and rapid intervention, and the nurses who worked there were accustomed to dealing with death, having seen it claim patients despite their best efforts more times than they could count. But something about room 407 felt different, an atmosphere that went beyond the usual sadness that lingered in spaces where people had died. Dr. Lee Min-jun had been working at the hospital for 4 years when the call button incidents began, and he was one of the few staff members who took the reports seriously, refusing to dismiss them as equipment failure or overactive imaginations. He had been on duty the night that Park Jae-hyun died in room 407, a 32-year-old construction worker who had fallen from scaffolding and sustained massive internal injuries that proved too extensive to repair. Park had been conscious when the ambulance brought him in, lucid enough to ask about his wife and young daughter, and Dr. Lee had stayed with him through the surgery and the hours afterward, watching as the man's condition deteriorated despite every intervention they attempted. Park died at 2:13 in the morning on September 9th, and in the weeks that followed, Dr. Lee found himself thinking about those final moments, the way Park's hand had gripped his arm with surprising strength, the desperation in his eyes as he tried to communicate something that he did not have the breath to say. The call button first activated exactly 1 week after Park's death, on September 16th at 2:13 in the morning, and the night nurse who responded, a woman named Kim Soo-jin, found the room empty but disturbingly cold, the temperature at least 10 degrees lower than the hallway despite the heating system functioning normally. She checked the thermostat and found it set to the standard 22 degrees Celsius, but the room felt like a refrigerator, her breath misting in the air, frost forming on the window glass. She reported the incident to the supervisor, who made a note in the log and promised to have maintenance check the heating vents. But the next night the call button rang again at the same time, and the night after that, and the night after that, always at 2:13, always from an empty room. The staff began to dread the approach of that hour, some of them finding excuses to be on other floors when it happened, others responding dutifully but with increasing reluctance, never knowing what they might find when they opened the door. Dr. Lee heard about the pattern from Kim Soo-jin during a shift change, and he became intrigued by the precision of it. the way it happened at the exact moment of Park's death, as if something were marking the anniversary not just of the day, but of the specific minute when life had ended. He began to research similar cases in medical literature, looking for documented instances of haunting or paranormal activity in hospitals. And while he found plenty of anecdotal accounts, nothing he read prepared him for what he would experience when he decided to spend a night in room 407 himself. He told no one about his plan, not wanting to deal with skepticism or warnings about the futility of such an experiment. And on the night of October 7th, exactly 4 weeks after Park's death, he entered the room at midnight and settled into the chair beside the bed to wait. He brought a thermos of coffee, a notebook to record his observations, and a small recording device in case anything unusual happened that he wanted to document. The room was exactly as it always was, clean and sterile, the bed made with fresh linens, even though no patient was scheduled to occupy it, the medical equipment pushed against the wall and unplugged. He sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the hallway through the small window in the door, and he waited, listening to the sounds of the hospital around him, the distant beep of monitors, footsteps passing in the corridor, the low hum of the ventilation system. The first hour passed without incident, and then the second, and he began to wonder if his presence had somehow disrupted whatever pattern had been establishing itself, if the phenomenon only occurred when the room was truly empty. But as 2 o'clock approached, he felt a change in the atmosphere, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing minute. The temperature began to drop, slowly but steadily, and he could see his breath-forming clouds in the beam of light from the hallway. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself and checked his watch, the luminous hands showing 2:10, and he felt his heart rate increase, a mixture of anticipation and fear that he had not expected. At 2:12, he heard a sound that made him sit up straighter, a soft exhalation like someone letting out a long-held breath, and it seemed to come from the area near the bed, from the empty space above the mattress. He turned on his flashlight and directed the beam toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just the bare mattress and the metal bed frame. The temperature continued to drop, so cold now that he could feel it seeping through his clothing, chilling his skin, and then at exactly 2:13, the call button on the wall began to glow, the red light illuminating in the darkness, even though he could see clearly that no one was touching it. He stood and walked toward the button, intending to examine it more closely, but as he moved, he felt resistance, as if the air itself had become thick and viscous, making it difficult to push forward. He forced himself to keep moving, and as he got closer to the bed, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. The mattress was depressing, an indentation forming on the surface, as if an invisible weight had settled onto it, and the indentation was in the shape of a person, roughly the size and proportions of an adult male lying on his back. Dr. Lee stood frozen, his flashlight trained on the depression, and he watched as it deepened, the fabric of the mattress pulling downward as if something heavy were pressing into it. He reached out with trembling fingers and moved his hand slowly toward the indentation, and when his fingers crossed into the space above it, he felt something solid, something cold and yielding like human flesh, and he jerked his hand back with a gasp. The call button continued to glow, pulsing now in a rhythm that matched a human heartbeat, slow and irregular, and Dr. Lee fumbled in his pocket for the recording device, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He managed to press record and began describing what he was seeing, his voice barely above a whisper, and as he spoke, he became aware of another sound in the room, a wet rasping that he recognized immediately as labored breathing. It was the same sound Park had made in his final minutes, the death rattle that signaled the lungs filling with fluid, and hearing it again in this empty room filled Dr. Lee with a terror so profound that his legs nearly gave out beneath him. He wanted to run, wanted to leave and never come back, but something kept him rooted in place, some combination of scientific curiosity and the feeling that he owed it to Park, to witness whatever was happening, to acknowledge the presence that was making itself known. The breathing grew louder, more desperate, and the indentation on the mattress shifted as if the invisible body were trying to sit up. And then Dr. Lee heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice, faint and distorted but unmistakably human, speaking a single word that he could not quite make out. He leaned closer, straining to hear, and the word came again, clearer this time. A name, Soo-yeon, spoken with such longing and grief that Dr. Lee felt tears spring to his eyes. Soo-yeon had been Park's daughter, only 5 years old, and Dr. Lee remembered him asking about her in those final conscious moments before the pain became too much to bear. The presence in the room seemed to be reaching out, trying to communicate something that transcended the barrier between life and death, and Dr. Lee found himself speaking aloud, telling the empty air that Park's family was being taken care of, that his wife and daughter were safe, that he did not need to worry anymore. As he spoke, the temperature began to rise, slowly returning to normal, and the indentation on the mattress gradually smoothed out, the fabric returning to its original shape. The breathing sounds faded, growing quieter and more distant, and the call button stopped glowing, the red light winking out and leaving the room in darkness once more. Dr. Lee stood there for several minutes, waiting to see if anything else would happen, but the room remained still and silent, and when he finally gathered the courage to reach out and touch the mattress, he found it warm, as if someone had just been lying there. He spent the rest of the night in the chair, unable to leave, unable to process what he had experienced. And when the morning shift arrived, they found him sitting in the dark, his recording device still running, capturing hours of silence punctuated only by the sound of his own breathing and the occasional whisper of his voice as he spoke to the empty room. Dr. Lee reported his experience to the hospital administrator, providing the recording as evidence, though he knew it would be dismissed as coincidence or acoustic anomaly, and he was right. The administration thanked him for his diligence, but made it clear that they would not be pursuing any paranormal investigation, that the hospital's reputation depended on maintaining a rational, scientific approach to all matters. But Dr. Lee could not let it go, and over the following weeks, he conducted research into Park Jae-hyun's life, speaking with his widow and learning that Park had been plagued by guilt in the months before his death, worried that he was not spending enough time with his family, that his dangerous job was putting them at risk of losing him. His fears had proven justified, and Dr. Lee began to understand that what he had witnessed in room 407 was not a malevolent haunting, but a manifestation of unfinished business, a soul unable to rest because it had not said goodbye, had not been able to reassure his loved ones that everything would be all right. The call button incidents continued for another month, always at 2:13, always from the empty room, and then on November 9th, exactly 2 months after Park's death, they stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The room was reassigned to new patients, and life in the trauma ward returned to normal, though the staff who had experienced those weeks of nightly summons never forgot. And some of them, including Dr. Lee, developed a different understanding of death, seeing it not as an absolute end, but as a transition that sometimes took longer than expected, especially for those who died with words still unspoken and love still unexpressed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best. The story from Yangdong Hospital speaks to the persistence of consciousness beyond death, to the power of unfinished emotional business to create phenomena that defy rational explanation. But in Vietnam, another hospital would encounter something even more disturbing, an event that suggested not only do the dead sometimes linger, but they are aware of each other, drawn together in ways that the living can barely comprehend. What happened at Tan Son General Hospital would be captured on security cameras, providing evidence that could not be easily dismissed, and it would force those who witnessed it to confront the possibility that hospitals, places saturated with death and suffering, might serve as way stations for souls in transition, visible only to those who know how to look. The night security guard at Tan-san General Hospital had been hearing the sound of wheels rolling across tile for 3 consecutive nights, always between the hours of 1 and 4 in the morning, always coming from the direction of the east wing where the patient wards were located. Nguyen Van Than had worked at the hospital for 12 years, long enough to know every sound the building made, which pipes rattled when the heating system cycled, which doors creaked in the wind, which sections of floor squeaked under footsteps, and this sound was different from anything he had encountered before. It was the distinct rumble of a gurney being pushed through the hallways, the wheels slightly misaligned so they made an irregular rhythm, and each time he heard it, he would leave his post at the security desk and walk through the wards, searching for the source, but he never found anything. The hallways were empty, the patients asleep, the nurses stationed at their desks, and no one else reported hearing the sound, making him wonder if he was imagining it or if the long hours of night shift work were finally taking a toll on his mind. Tan Son General Hospital had been built in the 1960s during a period of rapid expansion in Ho Chi Minh City, a sprawling complex that served over 500,000 people in the surrounding districts, and it had the worn, overcrowded character of a facility that had been pushed beyond its intended capacity for decades. The East Wing housed the general medical wards, with rooms ranging from semi-private to large open bays with 20 beds, and the morgue was located in the basement directly beneath the main lobby, accessible by a service elevator that was used to transport bodies from the wards after they had been pronounced dead. Than had been down to the morgue countless times during his years at the hospital, usually escorting funeral home staff or police investigators, and he had never found it particularly unsettling, viewing it as simply another part of the building, functional and necessary. But in the first week of March 2007, something changed, a shift in the atmosphere that he could not quite define, but that left him feeling uneasy whenever he had to walk through the East Wing after dark. The sound of the gurney began on March 4th, a Sunday night when the hospital was quieter than usual, and at first Thon assumed it was a porter moving a patient to another ward, or taking someone down for an emergency scan. But when he checked the movement logs the next morning, there was no record of any patient transfers during the hours when he had heard the sound, and the radiology department confirmed that they had not been running any overnight procedures. The sound came again on Monday night and Tuesday night, always following the same route, starting from somewhere deep in the East Wing and moving slowly toward the main lobby, the wheels squeaking and rattling in that distinctive pattern. On Tuesday, Thon decided to review the security camera footage, hoping it would provide some explanation, and what he saw made his stomach tighten with a fear he had not felt since childhood. The cameras showed the hallway of the East Wing, grainy black and white footage with timestamps in the lower corner, and at 1:47 in the morning, a gurney appeared at the edge of the frame, rolling slowly down the center of the corridor. But there was no one pushing it, no hands visible on the handles, no figure walking beside it, just the gurney moving on its own as if guided by an invisible force. Thon watched the footage 3 times, checking to make sure he was not missing something, looking for wires or strings or any sign of manipulation. But the video was clear. The gurney moved approximately 50 meters down the hallway, passing the nurse's station where a single nurse sat reading a chart, oblivious to what was happening just meters away, and then it turned left toward the elevator bank and disappeared from view. Than fast-forwarded through the footage from the lobby cameras and found the gurney again at 2:03 in the morning, rolling out of the elevator and across the empty lobby toward the corridor that led to the morgue. And as he watched, the gurney seemed to slow down, almost hesitating. And then something happened that made him push back from the monitor, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The gurney stopped moving forward and instead began to tilt, the head of the bed lowering as if weight were being added to the foot end, and Thon could see the sheet that covered the surface, pulling taut and then depressing, an indentation forming that ran the length of the gurney, the unmistakable shape of a human body settling onto the padding. The gurney remained stationary for approximately 10 seconds. The sheet compressed as if someone were lying on it, and then it resumed moving, rolling slowly down the corridor toward the morgue entrance. Don sat in stunned silence, his mind racing, trying to process what he had just seen, and he realized that he needed to show this footage to someone else, needed confirmation that he was not hallucinating or misinterpreting what the cameras had recorded. He called his supervisor, a man named Pham, who had worked in hospital security for over 20 years, and asked him to come in early, saying there was something urgent that needed to be reviewed. Pham arrived at 6 in the morning, clearly annoyed at being summoned before his shift, but when Thon showed him the footage, his irritation evaporated, replaced by a grim silence as he watched the gurney move through the empty hallways. Over the following nights, Thon began to actively monitor the cameras, waiting for the gurney to appear, and he noticed a pattern that sent chills down his spine. The phenomenon only occurred on nights when a patient had died in the East Wing, and the gurney would begin moving approximately 6 to 8 hours after the death had been pronounced, as if it were on a schedule, coming to collect something that the living could not see. He started cross-referencing the times of death with the security footage, and the correlation was undeniable. Every night that the gurney appeared, there had been at least one death in the wards above. On the night of March 13th, a particularly busy night when 3 patients died within hours of each other, the gurney appeared 3 separate times, each journey following the same route from the East Wing to the morgue, each time stopping as if to receive an invisible passenger before continuing on. Dan decided that he needed to confront this phenomenon directly, to be present when it happened, rather than watching it unfold on grainy security footage. And on the night of March 15th, when he heard the familiar sound of wheels rolling through the East Wing, he left the security desk and positioned himself in the main lobby, waiting for the gurney to emerge from the elevator. He stood in the shadows near the admissions desk, his flashlight off, his breathing shallow, and at 2:17 in the morning, the elevator doors opened and the gurney rolled out, moving slowly across the polished floor. In person, it was even more disturbing than on camera, the wheels turning smoothly despite the lack of any visible force propelling them, the sheet on top perfectly smooth, except for the indentation that formed as Thon watched, the weight of an invisible body settling onto the surface. He could hear the springs in the gurney compress, could see the frame lower slightly as if bearing a load, and he noticed something he had not seen on the footage. There were wet marks on the floor, footprints appearing beside the gurney, bare feet that left damp impressions on the tile, walking alongside the rolling bed. Thon forced himself to move, to follow the gurney as it continued toward the morgue corridor, and as he walked he became aware of a cold draft, a chill that seemed to emanate from the area around the gurney, and a smell, faint but unmistakable, the metallic scent of blood mixed with something else, something organic and decaying. The gurney moved past him, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it, and as it passed, he heard something that made his throat tighten, a soft voice, barely audible, speaking in Vietnamese, asking where they were going, asking if someone was there to meet them. The gurney stopped in front of the morgue entrance, the doors closed and locked as they always were after hours, and Thon watched as the sheet settled back into place, the indentation smoothing out as if the weight had been lifted. The wet footprints faded, disappearing as mysteriously as they had appeared, and the cold draft dissipated, leaving behind only the normal ambient temperature of the hospital. Thon stood frozen, his heart pounding, and he realized that he had just witnessed something that should not be possible, that violated every law of physics and biology that he understood. He walked slowly to the gurney and reached out to touch it, half expecting his hand to pass through an illusion, but the metal was solid and real, and when he pulled back the sheet, he found the surface was wet, soaked through with water that had no apparent source. He pressed his palm against the fabric and felt how cold it was, cold enough that his skin went numb, and when he lifted his hand, he saw that it was stained with something dark, something that looked like diluted blood. He turned and ran back to the security desk, his footsteps echoing in the empty lobby, and he grabbed the phone to call Pham. But before he could dial, he heard the sound again, the wheels of a gurney rolling through the east wing, and he realized with mounting horror that another one was coming, that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that had been playing out unseen for who knows how long. Pham arrived within 30 minutes and found Thon sitting at the security desk, pale and shaking, the monitor showing the hallways of the east wing, where another gurney had just begun its journey. Together they watched as the scenario repeated itself, the gurney rolling through empty corridors, stopping to receive its invisible passenger, continuing on to the morgue, and Pham made the decision to contact the hospital director, to escalate this beyond the security department. The director, Dr. Tran, arrived at dawn and listened to their account with a skepticism that turned to unease when they showed him the footage, and he authorized a full investigation, bringing in maintenance staff to inspect the gurneys for mechanical defects, technicians to check the cameras for malfunctions, even consulting with a local Buddhist monk who had experience with spiritual matters. The monk walked through the hospital, his presence drawing curious looks from patients and staff, and when he reached the east wing, he stopped, his expression grave, and he told Dr. Tran that the building was saturated with death, that so many people had passed through its halls over the decades, that their energy had accumulated, creating pathways that spirits followed as they transitioned from life to whatever came next. The gurneys, he explained, were acting as vessels, guided by the collective memory of all the bodies that had been transported on them, and the spirits of those who had just died were following the pathway, being carried to the morgue not because they needed to go there physically, but because they did not yet understand that they were no longer bound by the rules of the material world. Dr. Tran was a scientist, trained in Western medicine, and he found the monk's explanation difficult to accept, but he could not ignore the evidence, the footage that showed gurneys moving on their own, the wet impressions that appeared without source, the testimony of his security staff who had witnessed these events firsthand. He authorized the monk to perform a cleansing ritual in the east wing and the morgue, a ceremony that involved incense and prayers and the placement of small altars at key locations throughout the building. The ritual took place over 3 nights, and during that time no further incidents were reported. The gurneys remained stationary, the hallways quiet. But after the monk left and the altars were removed at the insistence of hospital administration, who worried about maintaining a secular appearance, the phenomena resumed, though less frequently, appearing only once or twice a month rather than nightly. Thon continued to work at the hospital, though he requested a transfer to the day shift, unable to face the prospect of more nights alone with the wandering gurneys, and he was not alone in his reluctance. Several nurses and orderlies left the east wing, citing personal reasons, and those who remained spoke in whispers about the sounds they heard, the cold spots they encountered, the sense of being watched by eyes they could not see. The security footage from those nights in March was archived and classified as equipment malfunction, the official explanation being that electromagnetic interference had caused video artifacts that resembled paranormal activity, and life at Tan Son General Hospital continued as it always had. Doctors and nurses treating patients, families visiting loved ones, the daily rhythm of a busy urban hospital. But those who worked the night shifts, who walked the empty hallways in the small hours before dawn, they knew the truth, that the hospital was more than just a building. It was a threshold, a place where the living and the dead existed side by side, separated by a boundary so thin that sometimes, in the right conditions, it disappeared entirely, allowing those on both sides to briefly perceive each other in their parallel journeys. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. If you enjoyed these stories, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. And if you want to, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description too. Thank you for listening and wish you all the best.